to Sandy and Nora's podcast.
Hey, Nora.
Hey, Sandy.
What's up? How you doing? How's your week been?
It's so busy. Like, I just find everything accelerates in June to being way too much. And, you know, you're like running until July. And then hopefully things start to give in July. And you're like, whew, we got here. And then I'm like, but then my kids are out of school. So it's like even worse. So I'm okay. But like, I'm buried in end of the year concerts and tests and stuff. And it sucks. How are you?
Hopefully it's a little bit fun, at least some of the concerts, maybe?
No.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I'm doing okay. I'm doing all right. I had a good, pretty fun week. So I'm happy about that. It's good.
Amazing.
I've also been paying attention to a little bit of the Toronto mayoral election. And I mean, gosh, I can't help but be entertained by some of it. Like, I just came across this hilarious campaign strategy by the former police chief.
Oh, yes. Mark Saunders.
That's the one. He's created like a website that's just stopchow.ca. And I guess like his solution to stopping Olivia Chow is himself.
Well, I mean, he's a candidate. That makes sense.
For no real good reason. So like his website is very, very hilarious. It's just like a website against Olivia Chow, but for no real reason. It's just stopchow.ca and a bunch of like frequently asked questions. In fact, I'm going to read you one because I just think it's so funny.
Okay, I love it.
So like when you go to the website stopchow.ca, it's like Saunders is how you stop chow. Is what it says. And then there's like a frequently asked questions.
Okay.
Question number 1, I donated to Anna Bailau. What do I do?
What the fuck?
Answer, that's okay. You can still vote Saunders to stop Olivia Chow.
That rules.
Question number 2, I like Bradford. What do I do?
Seek help.
Answer, well, that would be our response is certainly seek help. But answer is, you can still like Brad and vote for Saunders to stop Olivia Chow. And it goes on like that. It's like, what in the world? Okay, buddy.
Does he answer the question, what if I want to vote for Olivia Chow?
That question isn't there. Perhaps that's something that you could submit to the website to look into.
That seems like a bit of a failure.
I also think it's hilarious that this is under a frequently asked questions section of the website, as though these are the questions that Mark Saunders is frequently being asked instead of, like what happened when you started targeting people in the queer community when you did that raid on that park, or why didn't you take seriously the serial killer in the Church Street Village, or why were you among the worst chiefs that the city has ever seen?
Why? All those things.
Yeah, I don't know. Those would be my frequently asked questions, but I don't know.
Well, you know what? The election is coming up soon. For everybody that doesn't live in Toronto and doesn't care about this, good for you. You shouldn't. There's no reason to care about this. But it is an interesting election because the frontrunner is Olivia Chow, which is why the Saunders campaign has purchased stopchow.ca. And she would represent a pretty significant break from the status quo in that city. And so I want to ask you, Sandy, your prediction for what's going to happen. But before I do that, I just want to say that it's been a long time since there was someone who was even ostensibly progressive in the mayor's seat in Toronto. It would have been David Miller a long time ago. And so if Chow wins, I mean, it's a big deal, ish. It's kind of a big deal. And so, yeah, Sandy, what do you think's going to happen?
I don't know. I mean, it's, look, I have, I believe that the powers that be probably are going to do their darndest to make Anna Bilau the person who wins. I think that the people who are kind of more elite in the city are not interested necessarily in Chow. That being said, she has the most name recognition likely. And it looks like she's doing well, but that was also the case in an election earlier in the 2010s. Was it 2012? I believe it was.
Oh, man.
And then she ended up losing. So who knows? But it's also like there's so many people in the race too. I can say for sure that I don't think Brad Bradford, who, people had been considering a front runner from the beginning, and I don't know fucking why. I don't think that his campaign is going to come back. This guy who starts his career kind of being this bike riding lefty urban planner type of guy, and now that he's running is become so close to John Tory and has decided to turn into a right wing. Who are you, Brad Bradford? He's just trying to. He believes, it seems like, the best way to win is to try to pretend to be a Ford or a Tory type character, which is all very weird. It's like I don't know who you are. And he's polling at the same level as someone like Chloe Brown, who's someone who is running a campaign from the ground, who's a Black woman who has a real average lived experience in the city, which, I don't know that many of the other candidates who are considered front runners can say. And she had a great showing last election. Which was just mere months ago, and it would be cool to see her do really well this time around as well. But it does, to me, if I was to guess, it would be between Chow and Bilau.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much emerging as being what's happening. I've heard rumors that Brad Bradford's going to drop out and endorse Bilau and try and get a seat on the executive with her because, of course, he's a city councilor.
He's going to endorse Bilau?
I mean, that's a rumor. Who knows? Maybe I made that up. Maybe that came to me in a dream. But
it just doesn't make any sense given the rest of his campaign. But nothing about him makes any sense. So,
no.
Okay, cool.
No, I think that Chow might have it. If I was going to put money on anybody, I would put it on her. And then it's going to be okay, so then what does that look like with an NDP former politician? I mean, it's been a couple of years since she's been elected. And as you said, she did run in an election, and I believe she came in third behind a Ford and a Tory. And, she totally might win. And here's hoping that she doesn't do what Andrea Horwath does in Hamilton now as the mayor of Hamilton, voting against, livable wages and... It's what the fuck? NDP. Amazing. But we'll see. We'll see. And good luck to Toronto. Of course, people should know that there's no ranked ballot or there's no transferable vote or anything like that. It is literally you pick one of these 102 people and one dog, and that's your vote. So that also is going to create a really weird dynamic because there are so many. I mean, in the top 10, there are everyone in the top 10 is conceivably a viable candidate.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So there.
It's weird.
Super weird.
So there we go. There's that. And yeah, I mean, it's Toronto. So for anybody who doesn't care, I mean, I get it. But also, I mean, what is democracy these days? It's certainly not geolocated. So whatever.
True. True. Toronto is still the most powerful city in Canada. Sorry, Calgary. I know you're trying really hard to change that. But it is interesting. And it is also happening at a time where there's not much else happening other than I guess there's some federal by-elections happening, but who cares about those? And we'll soon be drifting off into the summer, not caring about politics at all, right?
I mean, how is that possible? But you know what? Beyond that, I am sure that we have some people to thank this week. What do you think?
Yes, we do have some people to thank. So thank you, everybody who shared last week's episode. I know it was badly anticipated or hotly anticipated because we had taken some time off. And so thank you so much for your kind words upon our return. And of course, thank you for your patience while we took some time off. But this week, thank you so much to everyone who changed their donation or donated to the podcast for the first time, specifically Tavis, Kayo, Mason, Josh, and Dave who's an old friend. So, hey, Dave.
Cool. So, look, I listened to the daily news this week, as I always do. And thanks for doing it, as always. There was a story that you mentioned that I think we should mention here, just as a note to listeners. And that was your coverage on the changing permissions that journalists are being given / not being given anymore in Ukraine.
Yeah, things are getting more difficult there for journalists. Ukraine has been revoking some press credentials. I mean, compared to the beginning of the war to now, they're 474 days or something into the war, into the invasion. So it's not too surprising that the orientation of the government would change towards wide open press passes. But the Globe and Mail reported last week that one of their journalists, a photojournalist who actually was nominated for a National Newspaper Award this past year, has had his credentials revoked, and he has to submit to a lie detector test and all of these grilling from Ukrainian officials to see if he aligns with the national perspective, I guess, of Ukraine on the invasion. And the reason why this individual has been targeted is the same as a lot of other individuals who have been targeted, which is that he's from the Donbass and he has connections to that part of Ukraine. Though he's been reporting since 2014 on very critically of Russia. This is not someone that you could accuse as being pro-Russia or even sympathetic, really, to Russia. And so that's an interesting change in how this is going, I think, for Ukraine. It's, as I said, not surprising, but it's also not surprising from the perspective of the fact that they can do this. I mean, they can make these kinds of calls because that's what you do when you're in the middle of a war, but we don't get coverage about this kind of politic. We just get this has happened or this bombing has happened in this place or whatever. And then random notes about Justin Trudeau appeared in Kiev last week. It's like, what?
Yeah. So, I mean, with that news, I also think that it's important to read that news in conjunction with the news that Trudeau is allocating an additional $500 million to support Ukraine. And it's just like, what is going on? War is always bad. So I expect that none of this is going to get any better, and it's just going to get worse if we keep going along this train. So I just thought it was important to raise that for our listeners. And another thing that I just remembered as you were talking about that story that I want to mention is, did you see this news by the Globe and Mail that they've created a database of FOI requests?
Yes, secretcanada.com.
Yeah, I think that this is really interesting and really, really great. For anyone who's ever tried to file a Freedom of Information request out there, you probably know that in Canada, it sucks. Like it's not only hard, there's often a lot of denials. And if you do get a response, sometimes you'll get like the most uselessly redacted thing. And there's just this expectation that you just go and have all of the resources to make all of the appeals to get the information that you want. And so I'm really heartened to see the Globe and Mail, one, creating a database of existing FOI requests and so that people can take a look at, but also attempting to do some advocacy around this and just, calling our governments out for being so freaking secretive and non-transparent.
Can I be critical of it?
Absolutely.
Well, okay, so I agree with everything you said. This is a really important project, and kudos to the Globe and Mail and the team behind this. It really is good. Now, what people might not realize is that federal FOI requests were already public. You actually could already go through formerly released FOI documents on the government's website. What this database does is it puts everything together, and other levels of government as well, so you don't have to kind of go through all of the different websites to see what's available and what isn't. So that's positive. But I think that when we're looking at something like this, and this is going to be completely lost on the folks of the Globe and Mail, because they truly believe that if you put pressure on the government to be more transparent, they will be more transparent, and it will de facto be better for democracy. As if that's all it takes. Maybe not as if that's all it takes, but as if it only takes us paying attention to their secrets to make democracy better. And, as I say, a lot of this stuff was already public. And in some cases, journalists would get redacted documents that had already been released. I mean, that's a common thing that happens with FOI requests. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm very concerned about is the Globe and Mail focusing on their advocacy and their work. And this becomes more of a brand building exercise for the Globe and Mail than actually changing anything about the culture of freedom of information in Ottawa. Now, that's not the Globe and Mail's fault because it's not their job to change that kind of culture. Of course, their job is to hold people to account and give us the kind of information that they're doing here. But, if it turns into the big thing that they did on sexual assault, where the Globe and Mail declared victory, and this is so awesome, and look at all of these cases that we've managed to reopen. It's fast forward now, however many years that was, 8 or something, and it's like nothing's changed. So I do hope that people take a look at this website, secretcanada.com. It's totally impressive and interesting, but to keep our eyes on the prize, which is that even if our government had released all of these things on their own, and even if access to information was not as shit as it is, we would still have massive problems in this country because it isn't just that they don't respect freedom of information laws that make them so bad. Because again, these laws are actually really recent and parts of government functioned better 40 years ago because of neoliberalism. So anyway, that's my little bit of criticism, but it is a really great project. And so, people should definitely noodle around with it because it's totally cool.
Well, look, your criticism is kind of related to the main topic for tonight. So why don't we just get into that? What would it take? Yeah. What would it take to actually see some change in the way that the governments operate or anything else for that matter? It takes a movement. And what the Globe and Mail has done is it a movement? Nora, you had this excellent series of tweets this week that you wrote that I thought would be such a great starting point for a conversation on this, on what a movement is and what people think a movement is these days, I suppose. I don't know. I thought that your commentary, your analysis was really great. And so Secret Canada, movement, no movement? Well, I think people can guess what you would say about that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's not a movement at all. It's the work of one newspaper, which is potentially informing or could be informed by movements. This is, I think, one of the things that confuses people a lot, and not necessarily left-wing people. I think that anybody who's active in social movement building understands this, but for the vast majority of people who are not active in some sort of left-wing organizing, it can be really confusing to look at the world and say, I don't get it. These policies are unpopular. People are suffering. It'd be so easy for the liberals to just do X or Y, and they don't do that. And it doesn't make any sense. And so you look at the whole system and making absolutely no sense. And it's like, I don't know how to plug into this world, and I don't know how to make sense of this world, which is doubly disenfranchising and confusing. It makes you want to totally check out because it sucks, right? So I think that the vast majority of Canadians are in that position where they understand the politics, they understand the issues impact them in very important ways, but they don't necessarily have the understanding of, okay, so what does it take to change political consciousness, or how does it actually work for average people to force governments to do certain things? And the Globe and Mail might want you to think that they can do it on their own through really excellent investigative journalism, but there's always a limit to that. And that limit is really obvious, which is just that, you get published and it's like the end, no one cares, because there's nothing grabbing onto these issues to make them real for average people. And it's so funny because we actually basically talked about this last week as well, but in a different kind of sense. Social movements are so broken today that it is very hard for people to see what they are and what they should be, and then their interaction with government.
Yeah, I don't know that all social movements are broken. I think that there are some social movements that many of those of the people who are listening to this podcast right now would agree with that are doing really, really great. Right-wing social movements, fascist social movements, are having a really great time right now. But I also think that something has happened in the last 10 to 15 years that has like really warped what we think of as a social movement. Because I think, Nora, that people would say that something like Me Too was a social movement. And I mean, I have some critiques about that. Like, would you describe that as a social movement?
No, but I would say that it was close, really close to a social movement.
It could have been one.
And it could have been one. That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
Let's hear it. Explain why.
Well, so it had a lot of parts that are necessary for a social movement to be successful. It had widespread appeal, it had widespread support, tons of visibility, and it had multiple ways for average people to be involved in the movement. And so that could have been organizing within your workplace or denouncing something or talking about your own experiences with sexual assault or whatever. And those are all parts of a social movement. But what Me Too specifically was missing was some sort of vehicle to turn that sentiment and that excitement and the visibility into something political. And so what we were left with was appealing, individual appeals or maybe group appeals to power to say, you know, sexual assault is wrong. You are a government that seems to think that sexual assault is wrong. So let's push you to do certain things. But there was no ability for people to formally get involved. You didn't become a member of anything. You didn't, if you were to call a rally or something, there was nothing to continue that work after a specific mobilization had happened. There was no glue keeping things together. There was nothing keeping track of what was happening so that we could see movement and we can gauge success and we can identify how things had changed from moment to moment. And so, it could have happened, but we were not organized enough or at all to be able to translate Me Too into a proper social movement. Now, that's not to say that it didn't have different impacts, and it certainly raised consciousness, and it certainly mobilized a lot of people in different ways. But we can look back now and say, okay, but once that bulge of activity disappeared, what was left in its wake? And had it been a proper social movement, there actually would have been infrastructure that would have been left. I mean, the infrastructure could have been loose or it could have been well organized or whatever, but there was literally nothing. There's nothing. And worse than nothing, you had the liberals who have been very, very good for 100 years and more in this country of co-opting progressive sounding concepts and language and ideas. And they were the primary benefactors of a movement like Me Too, because they were able to do the smallest amounts of work and say, look, we are feminists, we're taking this seriously. And they didn't have the organized opposition from that infrastructure, which was missing, to be able to say, whoa, actually, like the emperor is freaking naked right now, folks. They benefited massively by not having those voices.
Yeah, one of the things that I think there too that was missing, I mean, in what you're describing is essentially like the lack of organizing, a way to shepherd people into what happens post mobilizing. And I remember, when we had just started up Black Lives Matter Toronto in the city of Toronto, it was a critique that we got a lot was like, you guys aren't organizing, you're just mobilizing and that's like a critique that probably is dead today. Like it's definitely a 2013, 2014 critique that I don't know if people are making those same sorts of critiques today, but it was like, our response to that was like, and yes, correct. We are not organizing. We are just mobilizing because there's so many great groups who've been organizing for decades. And what we're trying to do is shepherd people into knowing what those groups are doing and making sure that people who feel connected by us and feel excited by us, by our mobilizing, have a place to go. And so making sure that those other groups are involved in our organizing and making sure that people get directly connected so that they can, if they are getting involved in BLM, they also know about whether it's known as illegal or the groups who were at the time organizing for justice for migrant workers, or if it was people who were organizing to get cops out of schools, that we could connect those people and making sure that people knew about the organizing that was happening, and we were mobilizing for those causes. Like in addition to the overall cause of Black Lives Matter and focusing on anti-Black racism, and in particular the urgent issue of anti-Black police brutality, but also just making sure that people were tied into these other groups. And I think that was a huge misstep for Me Too altogether.
Yes. Well, partly because Me Too wasn't anybody, right? Like Black Lives Matter, especially in the earliest days, we literally can point to individuals and name them as being who helped coalesce things. And then in city by city in Canada, who was doing chapter-based work or who was doing local community organizing. I mean, Me Too didn't really have the same thing. And part of that was because I think I was such an online phenomenon that there really wasn't a way, I think, in a lot of people's minds to translate that into real life. It was like, you can call a rally, that's fine and that's easy. But how do you translate something like Me Too, which is denouncing, let's say, people in powerful positions for being violent? How do you operationalize that into on the ground movement? I mean, you could, but I think that the connection was a little bit more hazy. And there's a lot of other examples of this. I mean, like the anti-war movement, I think there's a lot of good people, very few groups doing really good anti-war work right now, but like it's not existent at all. And the impact of it not being existent is exactly what we're seeing in how Canada is interacting with Ukraine. When you look back at Afghanistan and at Iraq and how the anti-war movement helped to bring sense to what was going on. Like, keep in mind, right? We were fighting a horrible tyrant who was murdering his own people and he needed to be deposed. In Afghanistan, we were fighting to liberate girls from the Taliban, and it was a noble and just fight. And in both of those situations, thanks to the work of the anti-war movement, which was the sum of the parts of many different kinds of peace and anti-war groups that were located all over Canada that did some kinds of specific work like anti-nuclear war, doing some kinds of more general work like just anti-war in this rural community of whatever, this part of Nova Scotia. And they were able to plug into anti-war organizing that was very specific, and that absolutely changed how government talked about the war, and not just talked about the war, but I mean, journalists will erase this now and they'll say that the biggest decision that Jean Chrétien ever made as the prime minister was to not go to war with the United States. I mean, alongside the United States, not with the United States. But that was not a, yeah. I'm like, I mean, that's coming. No, it's not
Imagine
coming.
That.
Oh my God. That wasn't Chrétien. That was literally the work of the movement to do that. Now we can look at another movement today, and climate justice, I think, is it's a social movement. I think it's disjointed and it doesn't really know where exactly to put its power, but it's certainly more developed and advanced than a lot of other movements in Canada. And thanks to the climate justice movement, I mean, we are hearing conversations with these wildfires like, oh, it's probably related to climate change, right? There's a lot more common knowledge that's produced as a result of having a movement, a social movement around it. But anti-war, we can see exactly what happens in absence of it, which is that no one knows what to think about this thing other than, well, Russia's bad. We must stand by Ukraine and flood this completely unstable country with weapons. That should go well, right? And so we lose so much when we don't have those kinds of that kind of organizing that's happening around an issue, around some sort of massive issue. I mean, a war is not just an issue; it's many different issues, and it's a real shame. It's a real shame, and it completely changes what we envision to be possible in our left wing organizing.
In your thread, you talk about how there's a number of things that, people might describe as being good things for people to do, like a network of help and aid, or individuals who are taking it upon themselves to be the voice of like a complicated issue and trying to get people to think about it differently. And you name specifically that these things are not social movements. And I think that that's really important, because I think there's something about the way that the internet has impacted our organizing that makes it makes it seem as though things are happening that aren't. Like pre-internet, like, yes, you would have seen some individuals, talking about a particular issue, but generally they get to the point of talking about that issue because they're either some sort of expert, like academically or something like that, or they are connected to some sort of movement, some sort of groups of people who have said, like, this is the person who you speak to about this. This is why it makes sense. You can kind of skip that in the internet age and just become the person to talk about something through the way that you interact online. And it creates this sort of proxy for something that we believe is the same as something that's happened in the past, but it's not. And similarly with like networks of aid and help, it at the worst of times it replicates like the idea of charity, but I think that because of the way that we show each other how we're involved in these things, which might be very, very necessary in our communities, perhaps we think that that's enough if it's connected to a social issue. We think that that's enough in terms of movement building. But at times, what that can do is actually stagnate social movement building as we become really, really focused on the networks of aid that we are trying to provide, the type of service provision that we're trying to essentially provide in our communities. And if we don't then connect that to, connecting to other groups who are trying to create the same sort of services, or connect that to some sort of advocacy to make it such that the service is no longer needed, then we're not really movement building. It's like calling a food bank, which might be really good and really necessary in a community, but calling that in and of itself a movement against poverty. And it's not. It should be part of a movement against poverty, probably, but it's not. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we're so confused by this, I think, too, because well, first of all, there's an allergy to talking critically about things in a way that is to not say like fuck food banks, right? Which is like obviously not what we're saying. But I do think that people get their backs up when you are critical about these kinds of things. And then people do good work, and you don't want to necessarily say, well, your good work isn't a movement, because it's not, but that isn't the point of the conversation. And I know we're going to move into talking about, okay, so then what is movement building? But, while you were talking, I was thinking of this group that I helped to co-found. And what we do, it's called the Nikangana Foundation. And we provide very small amounts of money to people who need like short-term, fast money to pay for something that's essential. And a lot of people will pay for things like rent or utilities or whatever. And while I was going through the news last week, I saw that in Saskatchewan alone, something like $4.6 million is owed by people who are on Saskatchewan income support just for things like utilities. And I was thinking of how much money like our foundation makes and how futile it really is up against the fact that you have $4.6 million that's outstanding to utilities companies. And then you're like, well, who are utilities companies? And it's like, oftentimes that's the state, actually. Even in Saskatchewan, that includes cell phone. That's the state. So it's like, so how can people be against? And then all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute. There's a web here. And so, even though this foundation is great and people should donate money to it because we support a lot of really important initiatives and people that need the money, there's nothing that's actually challenging the power in the work that we are doing because it's very, very small. So then the movement becomes the sum total of people who are operating in the same direction and fighting against the same structural barriers, or moving with the same currents and helping the same kinds of people and being involved with the same kinds of people and being led by the same kinds of people. That's where you start to actually have movements coalesce. And so, it's easy to talk about this stuff in a very 10,000 feet above the earth kind of way. But when you get down to the ground on this stuff, it's also actually very easy to talk about what are the elements that we need then to build a movement. What is movement building? And how do we avoid pitfalls like the internet telling us that it's one thing, or feeling like we're never good enough because we're not doing anything significant? Or I think what the vast majority of people feel right now is like, I don't even know where to start. I'm not going to be the one to start these things. I don't even know what to do. And so I think about that a lot. I think a lot about the sum total of a movement, and then the parts that go into building that movement, and how critically important it is for those parts to be grassroots and accessible and easy for average people to plug into, because it is only through those doors of entry that you will actually get yourself into a broader social movement. But then, of course, there's a lot of work that the leadership has to figure out too. And that's where you get really exciting and interesting debates, but sometimes things get stymied as well.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. What are the elements that people need in order to successfully build a movement? I think first and foremost, the most important, the primary, the thing that you should always be thinking of when you're trying to evaluate whether something is movement building or not, or what the point is power. Everything is about power. If your action is not building power, then it cannot be a social movement. A movement is the building of power against the status quo. That is how it works. And that might seem a little theoretical and pie in the sky, but it's really not. It's just, you have to understand that for something to shift, for something to change, in the way that the world currently works, there has to be some force moving against its inertia. It's power. And for an average person, if you're someone who is in a minority, let's think about race. If you are Black in Canada, then you are going to be in a minority of people, and necessarily don't have just mass power amongst your population to be able to force a shift in the way that the government or the powers that be work. And so you have some options available to you. You can, if the issues are you're not able to access services because of anti-Black racism, you can provide those services for your community yourself. Absolutely. And that isn't going to build a movement against how things are currently operating, but it can fulfill some sort of need. But if there's a way in which you can start to mobilize people within your community and outside your community to care about the way that your community, if we're talking about race here and Black people, that Black people are being impacted in Canada, then you can build power against the way that the state is either ignoring or harming your community. And that is a critical piece of what is among the elements of social movement building.
Yeah. And then there's some just basic technical parts of it as well, which is we could look at other movements that have been very successful in coalescing the work that has been going on. And one of the examples that I like to talk a lot about, and I've written about it before as well, is the migrant justice movement. Migrant justice organizations have been around since there's been migrants in Canada, and a lot of the organizations have always worked together and some haven't. They're often regionally located or regionally based. Some are connected to unions, some are not. Some are connected to different language groups, or some are directed connected to different ethnic groups. And the sum of all of these groups coming together under one umbrella organization in Canada has just so amazingly increased the ability that migrant justice organizing has had to influence what happens in power, in the halls of power, but also in journalism. And so if you look at the pandemic, during the pandemic's, like the worst parts of the first year, the worst part of the first year for migrant workers, there was a consistent message that was coming out through media. And that was because the migrant justice organizers were on the same page. And it didn't matter who was being quoted. Oftentimes, there'd be maybe 2 or 3 advocates in every article. And that was across the board, from the Globe and Mail to the CBC to whatever. And they were always saying similar or the same things. They were always constantly reminding audience members or listeners or whatever about, pathways to permanent residency or whatever. And it made it such that journalists could easily translate what movement was saying to power, to politicians or to the owners of these farms or whatever. And if you look at the coverage, as I did, I mean, I know about this because it's in my book. The coverage related to migrant justice was so much more coherent and had so many more specific demands that then you actually saw politicians responding to in a much clearer way than any other movement during 2020 or 2021. I think probably by far and away. And then think of the, feminist issues. I mean, it was just scattergun. You can talk about anything. It was like, oh my gosh, we don't even know what our demands are because, there's so many demands. But they had a central organizing structure that allowed the groups to be involved or not involved, allowed for different kinds of interactions and coordination, and the impact was very clear. So when we're thinking about building movements, if you're someone who's in an organization, let's say that you're a member or maybe you're even in leadership, are you making networks happen? Are you reaching out to other groups? Are you meeting with other groups? Are you having roundtables within your communities with people that are doing similar or maybe a little bit different work to start the connection building between everybody and making the identification happen between the issues? That's really the glue that then starts to hold a social movement together, regardless of what gets thrown in its way.
And really importantly, those networks, they don't need to agree on everything. They don't need to be all a part of the same organization. They don't all need to have the same endorsement for Big P politics or anything like that. But they do need to have a general understanding of the power in which they are trying to shift. I mean, one of the great lessons of being involved in the student movement in the I always get this wrong, aughts, right? In the
mid-aughts.
In the mid-aughts was having this confluence of different organizations who were involved in what was going on, and some who were far more radical than others, and some who were more willing to engage with government, and some who were really no, fuck that. But either way, no matter where you fell, we were able to come together and agree on some basic things. And that was really important towards building a movement to combat the power that was impacting students at the time. And I think that, there's too much that some people, I guess, think of as necessary or prescriptive towards starting a movement, like starting an organization that is non-hierarchical and open, and anyone can come to the meetings and stuff like that. That's way too prescriptive. Do the stuff that works for you. If you are a super radical organization who's going to be doing a lot of direct action, maybe it doesn't work to have a super open organization. But if you are one that is trying to educate as many people as possible as part of your goal, maybe you do want a really open organization. What's really critical is that those two organizations can somehow come together and have some sort of conversation or can communicate in some way if they are working towards the same issue, if they're working on the same issue and working towards similar goals. Those pieces are really, really critical to movement building.
Totally. And that's, as I say, that is the glue that holds it together. It's those relationships and those networks. And you don't have to be friends with people. You don't have to be best friends. You don't even have to like anybody in the groups that you're working
absolutely not.
But if you're doing any kind of left-wing organizing and you have not had a coalition meeting in the last 6 months for whatever reason, whether it's related to COVID or whether it's related to everyone being burnt out or anything, organize something, call something. It's really, really not hard. And like, that's the only way that the anti-war movement is going to come back to life is actually that really slow, regional, local, city, town, rural, community-based group by group to actually create something that could be national or provincial in scope. That's really, really important. And through the process of doing that, then you do identify those experts. You identify the people that have the best command of what's happening, the best skills to be able to translate that to journalists or to translate that to politicians or the people who have the stomach to even do that. And then you've got the people who don't have the stomach to do that. And they're much more comfortable doing radical actions or whatever. This stuff isn't difficult if you go brick by brick. But if you look at this wall and you're like, how do I get to the top of that wall? It feels like it's impassable. It's not impassable, but we have been battered by 40 years of neoliberalism, and that has absolutely destroyed our natural tendencies to want to work with other groups or to want to work across difference or to want to work across issues or even in some cases to work with people doing the same work as you. So whether that is you found a young workers council in your community, whether that is you reignite a coalition that you had years ago to talk about racism in general and invite any group doing racism work, anti-racism work at all to join. Like, it doesn't matter. But what does matter is that we have no time to waste. And these are the pieces that then will form themselves into a broader movement. That's how it works. And as I say, there's some really good examples out there of groups that have been doing the work and that you could just copy. But also, Sandy, as you said, it's not prescriptive. And so it's about experimenting and just getting people together in the same room. That is, I think, the most important thing, because when you're together in the same room, what happens? You're energized, you're excited, you actually get to see people. It's so important because that is actually what will sustain you while you're doing this work.
And you know what? You saying that, I mean, that is the secret sauce of Trump. Like, that is the secret sauce of the right. Folks have undoubtedly noticed that the right has been holding these rallies over attending debates or over some other strategies that they could be using. They are prioritizing these rallies, and they also prioritize going to events where people are and bringing a bunch of people and inviting a lot of other people to come with them. There's a reason for that. And, for anyone who's done any sort of rally organizing before, or even like large convention organizing or huge meeting organizing, that when you get a bunch of people in a room together, you can really, really have this sort of energy where you can believe that anything is possible. You can get people to start working on an issue that does feel like you're up against a wall, like you say, and all of a sudden things become more possible because you see other people who believe in what you do around you and are willing to put a whole bunch of energy and excitement behind that. It is the sauce of how fascism makes a roaring return to popularity in the times that we're living in now. It's impossible without having those in-person spaces where people can feel like, oh, there's something here. And the right is doing that really, really well.
All the time. They're doing it everywhere.
Everywhere and all the time, wherever they can.